George of Denmark and Queen Anne suffered 18 devastating pregnancy losses and the death of their young son. But modern historians now know the disturbing cause that silently haunted the royal couple for decades. When he was born in 1653 in Copenhagen, Denmark, there was little to suggest Prince George would have anything to do with the English throne, except that is his wealth and power. George was the younger son of King Frederick III of Denmark, while his mother came from a line of German dukes. When his brother, Christian V, took the Danish throne when George was just a teenager, he seemed destined, even happy, to languish as second-rate royalty. But fate had other plans. Besides his pedigree, the biggest thing recommending George to England was his Protestant faith, as the once religiously unstable country was heading even more to Protestantism under King Charles II. As such, Charles was eyeing up George to become the husband of his niece, then Lady Anne, also a Protestant. Yet, even the idea of this contained scandal. George's marriage negotiations to Anne were a state secret, with Anne's uncle, the Earl of Rochester, and one of the English Secretary of States corresponding with the Danish government in utmost confidence to keep any information from leaking to the Dutch. But in 1683, the cat had to come out of the bag. George married Anne in the summer of 1685 at St. James's Palace in London. George and Anne got along well, and their relationship soon flourished into one of love and mutual admiration. It was no surprise then when Anne became pregnant just a few months after her marriage. As the English royal family was currently somewhat lacking in heirs, everyone looked on the pregnancy with bated breath. They would let out that breath into a sob. The spring after their wedding, Anne gave birth to a stillborn girl. Nonetheless, although it was a heavy blow, it wasn't out of the ordinary for the time. In fact, she and George bounced back so well, Anne was pregnant the next year, giving birth to a daughter, Mary. They had another girl, Anne Sophia, the year after. Anne was even pregnant again soon after. But this was just the build-up before it all crashed down. In 1687, horror came to the royal family. Both George and his two girls caught smallpox. The stress for Anne, who had already lived through her own infection and witnessed her loved ones perish years earlier, was immense. Before long, it triggered a miscarriage, with more tragedy on the way. Although George made it through the illness, his two baby girls did not. In a matter of days, his small and growing family had been whittled down to almost nothing, and the effect on George and Anne was heartbreaking. As one courtier related, they had taken the deaths very heavily. Amidst their bereavement, George's surroundings were also full of danger. In 1685, just after little Mary's birth, King Charles II passed, and the crown went to Anne's father, now King James II of England. As the daughter and son-in-law of a king, it raised Anne and George's profile, but it also put them in the middle of a power struggle that would bring down the throne. There was one thing seriously wrong with James becoming king. Although his daughters, Mary and Anne, were Protestant, he had converted to Catholicism decades before, at first in secret, but he now openly avowed his faith. For many of James's advisors, not to mention his family, this was an uncomfortable choice, and one that could set back peace by centuries. James's Catholicism had become increasingly obvious. Nobody in his parliament was happy. Then suddenly, George and Anne's public and private lives collided. Just after miscarrying and losing their daughter to smallpox, Anne was pregnant again, and at the end of 1687, she gave birth to a stillborn son. But just as she and George grieved for another lost child, alarming news came from another quarter. In early November 1688, Prince George received word that must have made his blood run cold. A Danish envoy informed him that his disgruntled brother-in-law, William of Orange, outraged at the papism running rampant at the royal court, was preparing to invade England in what would become the Glorious Revolution. George's response was surprising. Prince George liked to exclude himself from politicking, but that didn't mean he couldn't understand his surroundings or think on his feet. He told the envoy that since King James's army was as discontent with their king as everyone else, he would never take official command under the monarch. At the same time, George wasn't ready to turn traitor and decided to serve as a volunteer. It was a masterful high-wire act, and George would have to become even more agile. George accompanied the king's troops as they faced William's family feud-style invasion, ready to defend the throne in full glory. But as the days wore on, all he began to see around him was defection. George, who apparently still had some hope left for King James, Catholic or not, reportedly cried out, "Est il possible?" Is it possible? After every turncoat. Until, that is, he became one himself. On November 24th, 1688, just bare weeks after the invasion started, George finally threw in his lot with William of Orange. His act left a vicious mark. King James reportedly sneered, so est il possible is gone too. And although James downplayed George's defection in his later memoirs, witnesses could see just how much it affected him. As well it should have, for when the cordial Prince George abandoned him, it was the beginning of the end. In December, King James II fled to France, giving up his crown to his daughter Mary and his bellicose son-in-law, William. Though he never stopped hoping to get it back, what's done was done. The next year, William and Mary became joint monarchs, and as the pair had no children, George's wife Anne became heir presumptive. Perpetual motion, a revolution, and now a wife next in line for the crown. It was certainly not the life George signed up for when he came to England. And no peace was to come. In the following years, William had to constantly defend his crown from the old King James and his supporters, the so-called Jacobites, and George wanted in on the action. Paying his own way, George followed William's troops, only for William to deny him a place in the command. While William may have simply mistrusted George's battle acumen, his next snub was impossible to ignore. Not content to merely keep Prince George from power, William also kept him from his presence, refusing to let George even travel in his coach while on campaign. William also reportedly instructed his Dutch guards to never salute Prince George if they ever saw him, completing the humiliation. But there was a final straw. Prince George was a lover, not a fighter, And in response to William's ego trip about the army, George did the sensible thing and tried to join the Navy instead. It was no good. William took his absolute power very seriously and kept George from the water as well. Defeated, George and Anne retreated from William and Mary's court, but with an ace up their sleeve. In the summer of 1989, a miracle happened. Anne finally gave birth to a healthy boy, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester. With King William and Queen Mary still childless, it was the little prince who carried all the hopes for Protestantism and the Glorious Revolution. Though still on the fringes of King William and Queen Mary's court, Anne and George got a serious upgrade in the eyes of the government. But there was something seriously wrong. Just before Prince William's birth, Anne had suffered yet another miscarriage, bringing her total to 6 pregnancies with no children to show for it. So she and George must have been overjoyed when their breathing baby boy came into the world in Hampton Court Palace, and terrified when they saw how sickly he was. At 3 weeks old, George's son began experiencing horrible convulsions, and the cause behind them was alarming. As far as historians can tell, George's heir contracted meningitis during his birth, which had triggered the convulsions. More than that, this same meningitis also likely gave the little prince hydrocephalus, where spinal fluid builds up in the brain, increases the pressure to the skull, and can swell the head. All in all, Prince William was not an heir to hang a dynasty on, and so George and Anne continued trying to have more children, trying and failing. As George and Anne's son grew up, Anne was almost continually pregnant and continually bereft. They lost a premature daughter in 1690, an infant son in 1692, and Anne gave birth to a stillborn girl in 1693, before having a miscarriage in 1694. 4 more pregnancies from Anne, and George was still the father of 1 sickly boy. Even so, Prince William would outlive one of his adult relatives. Sickly or not, George and Anne's young son did bring them closer to King William and Queen Mary over the years. Tragedy struck anyway. In 1694, smallpox came back with a vengeance and carried away Mary, causing England to lose its queen and Anne to lose her sister. It wasn't the only consequence. With Mary's line locked into the succession, Anne went from heir presumptive to heir apparent, almost guaranteeing her the crown. Before she could get to the throne, she and her husband would suffer unimaginable pain. With Mary gone and King William aging, it was never more important that George and Anne produce children. Their desperation was clear, and their misfortune turned exponential. George watched as Anne became pregnant twice, and miscarried twice in 1696. And then witnessed the very same thing happen the next year. Possibly 2 of those miscarriages were of twins. Hearts plainly breaking, they kept going. In total, Anne would have at least 17 pregnancies, with only 1 leading to a growing child. But the same year they lost the last baby, George and Anne would lose the last thing they had left. In the summer of 1700, George and his wife were trying to get their spirits up, and their son Prince William had a birthday party where he danced for much of the night. It went sideways. Suddenly fatigued from the physical strain, William took to his bed, where he began to experience a sore throat, chills, and then a headache and fever. there was no coming back. Prince William's health plummeted until he expired after midnight on July 30th, 1700. Just a week after his 11th birthday, and with his devastated parents by his side. The young heir likely fell victim to, yet again, smallpox, or else bacterial pharyngitis. Perhaps saddest of all, however, is that the culprit is somewhat immaterial. Most experts believe he would have perished eventually anyway, due to the complications from his hydrocephalus. This hardly could have comforted Prince George and his wife. Prince George and Anne were overwhelmed with grief, but they didn't have the luxury of processing their emotions. After all, the monarchy was now in a crisis. In 1702, George's brother-in-law, William of Orange, died at the age of 51 after a bitter bout of pneumonia, turning Anne into Queen Anne and George into her consort. It was a long time coming, and also nothing either of them particularly relished. George was 49 years old, Anne 37, and both of them were dragging around a lifetime of grief with the little prospects of a royal legacy. But they did get some payback. George had spent much of his time in the English court on the outside looking in, but his myriad personal tragedies had rightfully eclipsed his concerns for his royal status. Now, however, Anne gave him everything he'd ever asked for. She made him Generalissimo of the English military and Lord High Admiral of the Royal Navy. Both quarters William of Orange had never let him touch. Where William of Orange had been an equal, if not a driving force in his marriage to Anne's sister Mary, George was happy to sit back and let his wife have all the power during her reign. He followed her lead in voting for policies, and except for the fact he never converted to the Church of England and maintained his Lutheran faith, was her man to the core. As historian Anne Somerset wryly put it, almost by accident, George achieved a major advance for feminism. George had long and quietly suffered from asthma. By 1706, his health was failing rapidly, and on October 28, 1708, Prince George of Denmark breathed his last. George's power over his wife only increased in death. One courtier described how, having lost so much already, Anne's sadness was unspeakable, and that she continued kissing him the very moment his breath went out of his body. Throughout their marriage, George of Denmark and Queen Anne suffered 18 devastating pregnancy losses and the death of their young son. At the time, doctors offered various interpretations for what was plaguing them, but none could truly explain or solve it. Finally, years later, modern historians now believe they know the disturbing cause that silently haunted the royal couple for decades. Perhaps the most likely cause is the autoimmune condition lupus, which can cause painful physical symptoms. Others believe that Queen Anne could have suffered from the lesser-known autoimmune disorder antiphospholipid syndrome, which is often marked by miscarriages. Prince George of Denmark only deserves his reputation as a footnote in history if you're not looking closely enough. Neither as flashy nor as feisty as his predecessor, King William III, his life was nonetheless heavy with scandal, revolution, and a dynasty in its last gasps. And for that alone, he's worthy of study. But if, as Winston Churchill said of him in 1930s, George married very little except to Anne, well, especially given all they endured, isn't that enough? Thanks for watching History Expose. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.